Morning, everyone, and welcome virtually to this session of Social Work Week about understanding the regulator in education quality assurance. My name's Phil Hallam, and I'm the Executive Director for the Education Quality Assurance function. I'm also the Executive Director for our in-house legal team, so I run the team that's responsible for providing our in-house legal advice. I also am responsible for our information governance and data protection function at Social Work England, so making sure that we keep everyone's data safe. And I'm also responsible for leading the registration team and the team that run the registration application process and the register of social workers in England. But today, really, we're here to talk about education quality assurance. And I'm just going to very briefly open this session before I pass over to my colleagues in the team who will explain in more detail about the work we do and how that work impacts on our ability to assure the public about the quality of education for social work in England. So, as I'm sure some of you will know, and particularly sort of if you've ever read our corporate strategy, education and training is one of our central parts of that strategy, really, and a very important part of our ambition as the specialist regulator for social work in England. So over the course of the last 2 years, we've done a lot of thinking, a lot of work prior to becoming the regulator at the end of 2019. And since we've become the regulator, around thinking and policy thinking around education and training, and also, of course, about post-qualification as well and the continuing professional development of social workers in England. So over the course of the last 2 years, we've done a lot of thinking around education and training, and we obviously created our education and training standards, and we'll talk more about those in a moment. And in doing that, we've obviously heard from a range of voices and experiences from people who have an interest in social work, whether that's employers, education providers, students, social workers themselves, and other stakeholders to sort of develop our approach to education quality assurance, but also then for us to really start thinking about how we can develop, maintain and improve education and training for social work in England over the next few years. Alongside our policy ambition around education and training, and obviously our desire to make sure that, sort of education and training thinking is taken forward into the future, the oversight of education and training and the use of our standards is also one of our statutory functions, and that's set out in our legislation. So as long as alongside our policy ambition, we have a statutory requirement to oversee our education and training standards and make sure that the courses that deliver education and training for social work in England are meeting those standards. And obviously for us and for everyone really, ensuring well-trained social workers are able to join the register and start practicing with a clear understanding of their professional standards, that's a key aspect of our public protection role. And particularly important for that really is our role in maintaining public confidence in the social work profession. So our education quality assurance function, alongside our other statutory functions in registration and holding the register of social workers in England, and also obviously our role in setting professional standards for social workers once they join our register, and our role in investigating concerns about social workers where they may have failed to meet our standard and taking action when we demonstrate that to be true, is a really important aspect of our statutory role. So our education quality assurance team, who you will meet some of in a moment, and the function itself is how we carry out that oversight role and how we ensure that we can demonstrate to the public that they can be confident and have confidence in the social workers joining the register, is how we do that. And now we're going to sort of talk a little bit more to you really about how that role works. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hannah, who's the head of education quality assurance.
Thanks, Phil. Julie, would you mind moving the slides on a couple? Another one for me, please. Back, I'm afraid. So a very warm welcome to everybody who's come to this session. As Phil said, my name's Hannah Brown. I'm the head of quality assurance. And it's so nice to see so many familiar names in the attendees list, but also some names that we haven't come across. Just to explain a little bit about what we're going to talk about. We thought you might like to have an insight into what happens within the education quality assurance team, and some brief details about perhaps what's involved within the inspections process. I'm really fortunate enough to have a couple of our inspectors here as well, who are going to talk about their experience recently of conducting an inspection and why they enjoy working as an inspector. And finally, the end of the presentation is going to be a very brief look at some of our standards. I'd like to point out that our website has all of the processes, and this isn't intended to be a presentation that will go into any depth about what the standards mean or how you demonstrate them. For those of you who have joined who are at course providers, I'd like to do some highlighting well in advance of them being released, is that we're going to be delivering some webinars and some training sessions against the new Education and Training Standards 2021. And if you're due to be reapproved over the next 1 or 2 or even 3 years, you're very welcome and encouraged to join those, and we can give you a bit more insight and far more detail about what's involved in the inspections process. So my team, as I said, I'm the head of quality assurance, and this was a picture that was right at the very beginning of the development of the education quality assurance team. Education quality assurance is quite a mouthful in itself, so you'll see it referred to as EQA quite a bit. So in my team, I have an operations manager, and I will have 6 education quality assurance officers, and I'm lucky enough to have 2 of them with me today. Our education quality assurance officers bring the quality assurance specialism to the approvals process. They come from a wide range of different backgrounds. We're lucky to have quality assurance officers who work closely on student engagement, student casework. We've got internal quality assurance backgrounds, or people who have worked for other regulators or other inspections processes. But it's fair to say of all those 6 education quality assurance officers, they bring quite a varied background in the quality assurance process. Some of them happen to have been trained as social workers, but for all intents and purposes, they are quality assurance officers. I've missed it off there, and I hope she will forgive me because she only started this week. And we also have a support officer, which is Clarissa, who joins us as well. So that's the internal team within Social Work England. In addition to that, we have 49 partner roles, and they're partners at Social Work England, both lay and professional inspectors who we collaborate with to deliver the inspections and reapproval process. So there's a difference. We're incredibly fortunate with the vast amount of experience, knowledge, skills that come from working with these inspectors. And this is the element that we instruct inspectors to bring the knowledge and specialism of social work and the viewpoint of somebody who perhaps isn't a regulated or registered social worker, to bring the insight into the quality assurance of education courses. So lay inspectors can come from a wide variety of backgrounds. We have a number of lay inspectors who are social work academics that don't have a registration at social work. But lay people can also come from backgrounds that mean that they don't hold a registration with Social Work England, but perhaps they are another regulated professional. We've got people with lived experience who operate in the lay role, or other people who have perhaps been in another role that's very akin to conducting inspection within education. Our professional inspectors are registered with Social Work England, so either they are out in practice as a social worker, or indeed are academics who teach social work but do hold a registration with Social Work England. So that's the team. Moving on, Julie. So I thought it would be useful for you to hear directly through from a couple of our officers. Unfortunately, Rebecca can't be with us today, but we have both Josh and Helen who were going to do some introductions on both the legislation and to give you some insight into their role, the engagement processes, and a brief insight into how does somebody become a registered social worker, what's the education process that they go through in order to become a registered social worker. So moving on, Josh. Next slide, please, Julie.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, I'm Josh Hemsworth. I'm one of the Education Quality Assurance Officers, and I specialise in covering the Southwest and Southeast region. A couple of slides I'm just going to quickly go through with you about our rules and our education and training standards next as well. So our rules set out what people can expect from us across appointments, registration, education and training, and fitness to practice. They will provide the detail of how we will regulate social workers across England. The rules have been developed with thousands of people across the country who have an interest in social work. As a result of this feedback, our rules are robust, evidence-based, and reflect the views of professionals. There is a specific set of rules that covers education and training, and they include how we are required to monitor and approve courses. So, for example, our annual monitoring process, course approval processes, and our reapproval cycles as well. The regulator will operate an annual process to monitor courses of initial education and training, qualifications, test of knowledge of English, BIA, AMP courses, etc., to ensure that all such courses meet the criteria set out in Rule 3.2, and will publish details of this process. I'm just going to drop a quick link in the chat as well, just so if people want to have a little bit more of a read on that, they can do. And Julie, if you wouldn't mind just skipping on to the next slide as well for me, thank you. So the Education and Training Standards 2021. So we have education and training standards against which we will approve social work education and training courses. The aim is to ensure that students who have successfully completed a social work course can meet our professional standards and can apply to be registered with us. Qualifying social work courses will be reapproved against these standards from September 2021. So it's just important to note that the 2021 standards were delayed a year due to the knock-on effects of the coronavirus. So the current 2019 education and training standards are traditional from the previous regulator, the HCPC. They cover a variety of elements from course design and delivery to practice elements. So one of these being example is number 6.2 on the 2019 standards. Is assessment throughout the course will ensure that students demonstrate they are able to meet the expectations of professional behaviour. Students need to be able to demonstrate they understand the expectations associated with being a regulated professional by the time they complete the course. And this covers assessment in both the theory and practice-based parts of the course as well. The expectations of professional behaviour include the nature of professional regulation and the responsibilities involved in being a regulated professional. So these standards are flexible to ensure that they can be applied to all the courses that make up the entry routes to the profession as well. I'm probably just going to pass you over to Helen in a second. Just before you do, if I could just have a little couple of answers in chat just to tell me how many routes do you think there are into it, if that's okay. Just have about 20 seconds of that, and then if we just skip on to the next slide, please, Julie.
So good morning, everybody. My name is Helen Chalice and I am the Education Quality Assurance Officer for Yorkshire and Humberside and also the North West. So a couple of areas there. And I'm going to take you through a little bit about our engagement and also about the routes into social work as well. So the routes into social work are actually fall under three main categories. There's the undergraduate route, and that can be a Bachelor of Science, Bachelor of Arts, has to be an honours degree, and that is the minimum requirement that we expect for to get onto our register, to apply to get onto our register, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Then there's fast track routes, so things like the frontline, step up, think ahead, and then there's also postgraduate routes into the profession, and that's things like masters, so MA, MSc, and there's also integrated degrees as well, where you can do an undergraduate and postgraduate qualification all at the same time. For our purposes and for order for you to be able to register as a social work, and it is a protected title, so in order for you to be registered and call yourself a social worker, the minimum education requirement that is needed is actually an undergraduate degree in social work. But with all of these routes, one of the things that is interesting is that they come in different formats. So, for example, and I see somebody's actually put that in the chat. For example, in the undergraduate route, you've now got social work apprenticeships, where it's a really good mix of you work for an employer, but you also gain a BA Hons or a BSc Hons in social work. Now, a lot of these routes, they vary in intensity, they can vary in the time that it takes, and also when and where it's delivered. So with social work apprenticeships, there's an 80%, 20% split between on-the-job learning and within the academic venue learning. And that's that's that. Next slide, please, Julie. Oh. So, just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what our purpose and our approach is. Obviously, being a specialist regulator and our focus solely being on the social work profession, we are quite aware and have that specialist hat on when we're doing any of this work. And our job is basically, our whole purpose of being is to assess courses to ensure that they meet our education and training standards, and we do that through a variety of processes. So it might well be that a course provider would like to create a new course. We will go in and look at approving that and making sure that it meets our standards. There might be some changes to courses as part of continuous improvement, or changing staff, or changing legislation that course providers would like to meet. So yeah, there's all those things that we look at, and also annual monitoring. Every year we go in and just double check that everybody is meeting the standards. And as part of that, and as part of our approach, we offer advice and guidance to the sectors. So we're very much relationship based, and that's why we are tied to particular geographical regions within the country, and that's to actually ensure that anybody delivering education and training has a named person that they can come to actually get advice, support, guidance around the processes that we have, and also any of the standards that we have as well. We are focused on enabling positive change. The other thing is that we are very much look at embedding social work values into the work that we do, and so we very much strive to build a collaborative relationship with all our partners. So it's not about a power imbalance. We recognise that everybody that is involved in this process is working to make sure that there is a quality education available for people who would like to become social workers. Our resources, well, we have our EQA officers. We have standards and guidance that's on our Social Work England website. We've also got advice on the website that actually talks you through the different processes that we have, and how long they might take and what you need to do, and the documentation is on there as well that needs to be completed. And also we work very, very closely with our regional engagement leads, who obviously you've met a few, as they are facilitating these sessions throughout the week. So we work very closely with them to get that holistic view of that particular course provider and the region that it operates in. And overall, our ambition is to improve the quality and consistency in demonstrating the education and training standards. So improvement is the name of the game. We want to make sure that the quality and the consistency of that quality is absolutely top notch. Now, one final point before I move on, and that is having a qualification does not mean that you are a registered social worker. It means that you are able to apply for registration with Social Work England. So it's not an automatic, you get the qualification, you get the registration. So I need to make that clear, because it does come up later as well. Thank you very much. I shall hand back to Hannah. Next slide, please, Julie.
So thank you, Helen. So as Helen has explained, there are key points that the EQA team gets involved with course providers. But over and above that, we think it's really important that there is plenty of engagement with education and the sectors that support education in delivering social work education. So here's a few of them. So very much so with the single point of contact for the EQA officers with course providers, it's really important that we understand the context in which social work courses are delivered. So quite often you will see us cropping up in meetings about teaching partnerships, perhaps during SWEN meetings. We also sit on skills for care. And we engage with our inspector partners because we have a really good section of course providers represented in our inspectors. We use those in an advisory capacity as well. So, for example, if we were to be delivering or sending out some guidance, it's quite frequent that we will engage with our inspector partners to be able to provide us with some advice on how things are structured, or perhaps the wording is slightly different for course providers than it would be for a regulator. Yes, we do link with teaching partnerships. So quite often we sit on, and we always encourage teaching partnerships if they want any advice or they would like to invite us to any of their meetings, then you're very, very welcome to. That also goes for the regional engagement leads. So yeah, we have teaching partnerships that report into our education and training, sit into rather than report, our education and training forum as well. Another key part is the stakeholders, and that's one word, but it actually means we talk with students, we talk with placement providers, employers, and we try to get an understanding of a more holistic view of how courses are being delivered. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the things that we've done and reacted to during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I suppose it's fair to say that the engagement with stakeholders during this pandemic response has dramatically increased our understanding of how social work education is being delivered in what is an incredibly challenging period, both for the course providers delivering the courses and for students in receipt of social work education. Next slides, Julie. So over and above the external engagement, internally within education quality assurance, there's a number of different structures. So if you have been to other sessions during Social Work Week, these might be more familiar to you. And we have in Social Work England a national advisory forum in which some students sit, but also people with lived experience sit. We have course providers who sit within our education and training forum, our regional engagement leads, and we link up very much so with our other regulatory bodies, whether that is the other regulatory bodies that deliver social work education and quality assurance processes, so within Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but also to make sure that we as a regulator sit within the wider regulatory landscape. So there are inter-regulatory bodies where education policy and processes are debated and defined and developed to make sure that we have a strong presence in regulatory forums. As I mentioned before, partner inspectors are engaged, and we have a real clear link with fitness to practice, where any themes or developments that either we find or fitness to practice find, it should be very much a circular process where if there are things that need to be conveyed back into the education processes from fitness to practice, that there's a clear link between communication with us. We also work with our professional advisors across Social Work England, and these are specialist social workers or layperson who sit within Social Work England to provide particular specialist advice on areas that we need. Next slide, Julie. So many of you might have come here to find out how we actually do the quality assurance process, and perhaps a little bit curious about what do the inspections actually involve. And I'll briefly explain this to you, but I would encourage, if anybody is interested, by all means arrange to have a chat or have a look at our website, and there is far more detail about it. So our inspections are slightly different from the previous regulator. We operate as a three-party inspection process. So it is an education quality assurance officer. So that's either Josh, Helen, Rebecca, Naomi. And they will go in with both a layperson and a registrant inspector. During COVID-19, we've moved to a remote inspection process, so it means very much the same as this. An inspection usually lasts between 3 and 4 days. And pre-COVID-19, this would have been on site at the course provider's location, or perhaps it would have been visiting parts of the practice placement. There's an agenda that we work to, but there is no set agenda for all inspections. Actually, the agenda is worked out very closely and collaboratively with the course provider to make sure that there are elements that we can have access to speak with, and also that the evidence that they've provided as a documentary evidence well in advance of the inspection, we adapt our inspection to make sure that we utilise that time most efficiently. So some things that can happen on an inspection can range from just a tour of the premises to see whether the resources, the library, the computer systems, the resources that students have access to, that plays a key part. But I would say that the meetings that we have with stakeholders involved with the course, it's highly likely that we'll meet with staff members who are delivering the teaching of the course. We'll also meet with management, and indeed senior management or university management who are responsible for the social work course, professional lead. It would be highly unlikely for us not to meet students who are involved in the course to understand their perspective, ask them a series of questions, and adapt and triangulate their advice back to us when we are making recommendations back to the regulator. We'll meet with whatever people with lived experience are involved in the course. And we'll also highly likely that we'll meet with practice educators or the placement advisors, people who are involved in delivering the placement for students. In addition to that, we might look at some more of the resources that are delivered within the inspections, or what the course provider is actually doing. And there's a great deal of questioning that we do against the documentary evidence that we look at in advance of the inspection. We'll make sure that what's happening perhaps in a policy is represented in real life and being delivered by the course. So I hope that gives a brief overview, but in actual fact it might be useful to hear from two inspectors, and I'm really lucky to have two who are available to talk to us and give their impression of what they enjoy about the inspections and their experience of doing some recently. So Julie, if I may move you on slide wise. Yes, we do regulate, just answering a question very quickly, we do regulate mental health, the AMP courses. I will talk about that a little bit later on, if I may, Stephanie, and hopefully we can answer some of your questions around that. So our inspectors, we're lucky enough to have Bev and Serge, who've recently done inspections with me. I'm going to split I'm going to ask Serge first of all to give us an introduction and her impression or an experience of conducting inspections. Serge, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name's Serge Saldullet. I'm a registrant inspector. I'm also a practicing social worker, AMP and BIA. In preparing for this discussion this morning, I had to think back to when I applied for the registrant inspector post and attending my induction. And I remember vividly Hannah speaking about the need to work in collaboration with our providers. And you know that was what we would hope to be our underlying ethos. And having now undertaken one inspection most recently, I can confirm that that's certainly, you know, the underpinning to our work. The essence of our inspections is true collaborative working with our education providers. And that includes working with providers to gather information, taking a very open and transparent approach with each other. So, you know, being open to having that exchange of information, going back and seeking clarity from the education provider, but equally being open to questions ourselves and to clarify what we're seeking, what we're also looking for. And that exchange of information, what that I found that enables us to do is really take a holistic approach to the inspection process. And not only that, it's not just about that exchange of written information, it's about who we involve in the inspections. And certainly in the inspection that I've been involved in, one of our key priorities, and certainly the provider as well, were very keen to share how they've involved users with lived experience, carers, employers, placement providers, practice educators, and you know, really provided a robust evidence about the involvement of other people in the process. And what I would say about the inspection process is that each of us comes with our own area of specialism, with our own expertise. And that also enables us to really be thorough. It enables us to provide a holistic, evidence-based decision. And looking, if someone were to look inwards at a discussion that took place amongst the inspection team, I would hope what you would see, and certainly my experience of it is that there is no one person that that takes priority in terms of their viewpoints. It truly is that we work together and we come to a consensus. Certainly from my perspective, when I was involved in the inspection, my perspective was informed by social work practice, the reality, real life, and what is current for social workers out there. So just to give you an example, the inspection I was involved in took place after COVID and new ways of working. And what I was very keen on finding out from this course provider was how do you intend to adapt your approach to ensure that business carries on as usual, for want of a better term, that we continue to support students through a course, and we ensure that their experience is what they deserve and what they should have, and also to ensure that it doesn't affect the quality of the training. And that was, you know, that was a very positive discussion, because I should imagine, like most of us, everybody has had to adapt their ways of working. The process of considering evidence is really, really very robust, and it starts from the beginning point where a course provider will share their information. And the positive, one of the things that really stood out to me was the independence, that whilst the inspection team, we reach a consensus, our starting point is considering information independently, forming our own views, forming you know, our own questions on things that we'd like clarifying, anything we'd like to see more of. And it's only, and once we've done that independently, we then get together and we discuss and review our findings. We share our findings, have many discussions, and then analyze our findings in order to reach a consensus. And the, you know, what I've also found positive about an inspection process is that discussions are open. We have discussions at several points in the process. At the beginning, part way through, we're open to having additional discussions if we need to. And my impression of the course provider that we actually undertook the inspection with was that they actually found it very helpful to have that going back and forth, to have those open discussions and dialogues, to have us come back and say, well, actually, this is what we thought, we just needed a little bit more extra around. So that's been very helpful, and what that's reinforced to me is the whole process genuinely is a collaborative working with all parties that are involved. But just one last point in terms of looking at how social workers, practicing social workers, are involved in the work of Social Work England. So it's not just the inspection side, but just as Hannah's mentioned a little while ago, you know, we are called upon to see if we'd like to be involved in, a current example is we're looking at the education standards for AMP and BIA courses. So we have been contacted to see if that's something we'd like to be involved in. And as you can imagine, there's many of us that have jumped at the chance. Thank you. I'll hand back to Hannah.
Thank you, Sez. That was really helpful. Next inspector is Bev, who was in one of those pictures earlier, but Bev was very involved with us in setting up many of our processes. Bev, I'd be really grateful to hear some of your thoughts on carrying out inspections.
Thanks ever so much, Hannah. Good morning, everyone. My name's Bev Blythe, and I'm a registered social worker based in the northeast of England, if you can't guess from the accent already. I actually qualified back in 2004 in the days of the DIPSWA, and I have a background in statutory social work, practice education and university teaching. And currently I'm an external examiner, still a practice educator, but my main practice area has moved to that of a court of protection visitor. I got involved in inspection actually back in 2012 with the previous regulator, but with the announcement of the creation of Social Work England, I was very excited about moving back to a dedicated and specialised regulator just for social workers. And I wanted to continue my interest in education and inspection work. So I applied to become a partner with the education team and was really lucky to be appointed. And since I've been appointed, I've assisted with some consultation work that Hannah mentioned. I've also helped with some major change processes at some of the education providers. And I've had my first ever remote inspection, which was actually for one of the social work degree apprenticeships. What I found is that my experience with Social Work England has been that as registered social workers, we've got a really strong and valued voice. Those working within the organisations who are not social workers themselves take great pride in learning more about the profession and how that'll actually feed into education inspection work. They've certainly valued our input in helping navigate what I think we all agree is a unique social work world. And I think we've come into our own and helping translate things such as what I like to call the social work bingo of acronyms that can seem like a foreign language to those outside the sector. And we've helped navigate the unique frameworks and practice areas of social work for our lay colleagues as well. I hope as well that they will continue to respect and value our work, and there's a certainly clear indication that consultation will be ongoing and that they will be involving all sectors across the country. What I found with my remote inspection was that it was very collaborative. It consisted of myself, a lay colleague. In this case, it was a colleague with a university background and an education officer. Prior to the inspection, we undertook a significant amount of pre-reading of documentation. We shared our initial thoughts on paper and then arranged a virtual meeting to consider any emerging themes and areas for further probing and questioning at the inspection event. We agreed on what questions would be asked, who would ask which questions, and how we could build in some reflection time within the agenda. We were able also to feed back to the education provider information that would be useful for the team to see to assist with our decision making. It was about enabling the provider to demonstrate how they meet the standards in the best way possible. With the actual inspection itself, this was actually spread over 3 days, and it was actually very tiring doing this on Microsoft Teams. I think more so than in the real world, if I'm honest. During that time, we met with multiple groups of people, including the course team, senior university management, placement providers and educators, and also with social work students and people who use services and carers. I wanted to just let people know some of the areas we focused on, and I just wanted to pick some areas related to our meetings with social work students. We covered things such as admissions, how the students found the process, how well informed they were, what information they were given. We talked to them about their curriculum content. What are they being taught? How are they being taught? Is it an effective methodology? What changes have been brought about by blended or online learning? We covered things such as assessment with them and how they are supported in their assessment. How do they get feedback? What range of assessments are used in relation to the course? Who assists with assessment and how are those contributors trained to assess fairly? We looked at placements with them, how well supported they are, how safe they feel on placements, and especially what happens when things go wrong. And we also looked with the students that governance on the social work course is the course well supported with staff levels, how appropriate checks and balances that are in place, how do students actually complain. And finally, we also considered their level of involvement, how do they contribute to the course, its governance, and how is feedback accepted and acted on. I just wanted to share with people that I really genuinely feel the inspection process is not an adversarial one. I don't think it's stiff either. We aren't looking to trip course providers up or flex any metaphorical muscles. As a team, we try and encourage a dialogue around our questions, ask contributors to elaborate on areas of interest or concerns, but ultimately we have to ensure that we're making sure a social work course is safe, with robust training and producing suitable candidates with the right knowledge, skills and values to apply to join the social work register. It's a really enjoyable role, and we're lucky to see some great and innovative practice and meet some very inspirational people involved in social work education. And I would certainly encourage anyone who is out in the sector, if they want to get involved in Social Work England. I've found it a very, very positive experience. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Bev. Thanks for that insight. Next slide, Julie. So the remaining part of this presentation is just briefly talking about the education and training standards for 2021. And I want to start by saying we're not going to go into very much detail about what those standards are in any detail whatsoever. They're available on our website, and I would encourage you to look at the guidance that sits amongst those education training standards. I think Helen's explanation of the routes into social work, one of the things that's really evident to us is the variety of the different courses and the different ways in which they are delivered. So quite often these education training standards can feel quite broad, and indeed the way that course providers can demonstrate meeting them can be in a number of different ways. So one of my favourite things in working in EQA is finding out that course providers can demonstrate a standard in a huge variety of different ways, and yet still the importance of bringing inspectors in is to say that one version of meeting the standards is exactly the same. The quality is still there despite it being delivered in such a different way. One of the challenges with the education and training standards is to provide some parameters about how those standards can be delivered and our minimum or maximum expectations of how those standards are delivered. And during COVID-19, particularly with where the previous standards had to be adjusted or be flexible enough, quite often we would have course providers who would approach us and say, how can we adapt and demonstrate these standards when it's particularly challenging at this period of time? So I'd like to provide a bit of reassurance that those 2021 standards, even during this time, there's still plenty of flexibility within those particular standards. And I would encourage, if any of the course providers who are attending this one are curious as to how the standards can be demonstrated, we will be providing further training, as I've mentioned, but it's well worth getting in touch with us if you, as a course provider, are struggling to think how that standard can be demonstrated for your own localised arrangements. Social work education in England is incredibly, it's a clouded landscape. That's language that we use across, I'm sure you've heard, across Social Work Week quite a bit. And the frameworks that are against which education for social work is delivered, there's many of them, and it can be quite complicated to work out how the education and training standards can be mapped and demonstrated whilst bringing in those different frameworks. So very briefly, we're going to cover each of the education and training standards in brief overview. So there's 6 main areas in which standards are delivered. So moving on, Julie. So Josh, I think you're very briefly going to cover the admissions.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, just for the last 12 minutes. So for standard 1, which is our admissions, a bit of an overview is the standard. So admissions processes must be robust, transparent, ensure that applicants meet course entry requirements and involve a range of stakeholders. The outcomes we're looking for is social work courses recruit students who have the capability and suitability to develop the knowledge and skills necessary to meet the professional standards and become registered upon completion of course. So the key areas that we're kind of looking at here is the confirm on entry to the course via a holistic multidimensional assessment process that applicants have the potential to develop the knowledge and skills necessary to meet the professional standards. The qualification outcomes, for example, we're looking at English. So typically for UK applicants, this will be a GCSE English grade C4 or above. And non-UK applicants should achieve a minimum score of 7.0 overall in the International English Language Testing System. We're also keen at looking around the documentation available for students as well. So course handbooks, anything that's able to make students make an informed choice prior to starting onto the course as well. I have just popped a quick link in the chat as well, just for our education and training standards, if people want to have a little bit more of a look in depth as well, but I'm just cautious of time. So I'm just going to probably pass you on to Helen for the next one.
Next slide, please, Julie. Thank you. So standard 2 looks at the learning environment, and it's really exciting, this one, because for the first time it brings together the environment as one. So the learning environment must provide education and training opportunities for students to develop the skills and knowledge across all areas of social work. So they're able to gain that experience in practice settings to meet the professional standards, and those settings must be supportive, supervised and safe. So the outcome of that will be that social work courses will deliver in partnership, and that's a key word, partnership with practice placement providers, practice learning experience that support readiness to practice. So one of the things about this standard that I'm really excited about is that it brings together all of the different learning environments. So it's the practice placements, if it's an apprenticeship, it's the workplace, you know, all those kind of things come together and dovetail so that there is one continuous learning experience that's joined up and that is directed for that student. That's really exciting for me. Next slide, please, Julie. And this links directly into the next standard, standard 3, which is all around course governance, management and quality. And what we expect as a regulator is that social work courses must be governed, resourced and managed using effective and transparent processes. And those processes need to be both implemented and reviewed and evaluated in collaboration with employers, especially around the practice placements, and people with lived experience of social work. That's vital, and that in this standard is quite beefed up. And we expect people with lived experience and employers to be involved in all aspects of the course. And that there must be processes to actually monitor and manage the quality and delivery of courses. So it's not, and we will be looking not just at the process, but what actually happens with that process. How does it work in practice? And the outcome of all of this standard is that they are courses are managed, governed, continually improved and administered to a consistent quality, and that they're actually resourced sufficiently so that they meet our expectations. Thank you. Over to Hannah.
Thank you very much. So the next standard is standard 4, and it's important to mention, if you're not familiar with the standard, there's one overarching standard but very many parts underneath it. So standard 4, for example, has 13 parts underneath that. This standard is particularly important when it comes to equality and diversity and anti-discriminatory practice. This one here is a number of different standards about enabling students to develop required behaviours, skills, knowledge and understanding to meet our relevant standards. So quite often we will ask information about multidisciplinary working, how course curriculum is updated regularly, and how students can learn from other further professions. Moving on very quickly. Standard 5 is about supporting students, and this is both whilst on practice, relationships with practice educators, and indeed how students may access appropriate education and pastoral support whilst on the course. So quite an interesting, with the variety of the different modes of which social work education is delivered, that can feel very different in different inspections. You're not asking the same question for an undergraduate student to one who is in a work-based environment, perhaps on a fast-track team. So quite often there's a number of different standards that we will very closely focus during these particular questions, and how we can see that students are supported to understand what the assessment mechanisms are, and where they develop both the knowledge and skills necessary to meet professional standards when they qualify. I'm just going to end with the final standard, which is the level of qualification to apply for entry onto the register. And that's in fact just one standard on this one, and that's the qualification that's required to eventually join the register. Very finally, I know we've got just the remaining 5 minutes, so I was hoping I might be able to squeeze in just some brief insight for you about the impact of COVID-19 on the education quality assurance process. And then I can see that we've got a couple of questions, and I would invite you to continue to put any questions that you've got for us in the comments, and hopefully I can squeeze that in the last 5 minutes. So it's fair to say that higher education, further education, has been dramatically impacted by COVID-19, both in the delivery of courses by course providers, but also students have been incredibly challenged in the delivery of and completion of their courses during this particular time. For us, that has resulted in a huge increase in the number of inquiries and engagement requests, where people are trying to work out how to adapt courses, what support is available for students. And so the education quality assurance process and officers have continued to engage with both course providers and any stakeholders who are involved in courses. And that has ranged from absolutely everything. It's fair to say that as a regulator, social work regulator, you're asked to provide insight and impact into a number of areas that perhaps don't fall under our role. So, for example, bursaries is an administrative process that doesn't fall under regulation by Social Work England. So during this time, it was vital that the quality assurance of course providers continued. And as a new regulator, we had much begun to start doing on-site inspections. And so after March, when students were sent home from course providers, it was a very difficult thing to continue to do on-site inspections. And after lockdown, of course, it was incredibly difficult to continue with on-site inspections. So we moved to a remote inspection process, and both Serge and Bev have taken part in those. So they are delivered in a format very similar to this. So the number of inquiries that came as a result of COVID-19 could really be themed particularly around students having trouble with either completing placements or placements having to be adapted, the no longer availability of some placements. And indeed, later on, once the changes with the A-level admissions and assessments, the delay to some courses and being able to sign off the assessments, or indeed relaxing some of the requirements to do with assessments, we issued plenty of guidance, or hopefully plenty of guidance, that reassured course providers that there was flexibility in meeting the standards at this particular time. I think we understand that the adjustments that are needed at this particular time is an emergency response, and therefore it's really vital that we as a regulator show that there is flexibility, and we reduce the regulatory burden on course providers delivering courses during a particularly challenging time. So we made some adjustments to the timescales for the annual monitoring. This was a part data collection and also either an audit or a declaration, and we pushed it to the latest possible time that we could do for annual monitoring. One of the biggest things that we did was postpone the introduction of the 2020 standards, which are now the 2021 standards. They were due to come in September last year, but actually what is termed the 2019 standards do have a bit more flexibility built in them, particularly around, for example, placement days, which were proved actually incredibly difficult to to monitor during the period of this. And as I said before, we're pushing back on the timescales for commencing reapproval cycle. So following the introduction of the 2020 standards, our reapproval cycle, so the reapproval of all social work courses, will start from September this year. Very shortly, we'll be going out to let course providers know the dates in which they are going to be reapproved. So that's the end of the presentation. I'm conscious that there are a couple of questions there. One of the ones that I picked up was, do we interact with the CQC? Yes, we have had interaction with the CQC. They're not a main stakeholder, I would say, in the communications. I can fully recognise that they have very similar processes to us, and I'm really familiar with their work. So I don't believe they currently sit on any of our forums, but there's no reason why we wouldn't want to interact with them. Up above, there was a particular question from, I believe, a student around anti-discriminatory practice. It's really vital that we get to hear about those concerns, and we certainly have heard concerns around that particular area. I've met with a number of different national forums of students who've raised concerns about practice education and anti-discriminatory practice. Our new standards from 2021 do bring in some additional areas that inspectors can particularly inquire about in those particular areas. And it's very important that I mentioned that our National Advisory Forum and our Education and Training Forum has equality, diversity, inclusion, and this has absolutely been recommended and reported and presented at those forums, and we're acutely aware of the problems in those areas. So if there are no further questions, I suppose it's just to say thank you very much for coming to our presentation. Perhaps, Julie, you've got the ending of this presentation. Is there any housekeeping that you need to do?
I do, just a little. So thank you for asking those questions that were posed in the chat. Unfortunately, we won't have any time for any more as the session has now reached its conclusion. But you can reach us outside of this session at Social Work England. So, of course, you can reach the Education Quality Assurance team, and the links that have been provided earlier will show you how you can do that. And also you can reach us via your regional engagement lead. And I know that that's been highlighted earlier as well. So all that's left to say really is thank you to the EQA team for their presentation. My colleague Kate has popped a survey into the chat. If you wouldn't mind completing that, we'd greatly appreciate your feedback on the session, and we'll collate all the feedback about all the sessions we've had during Social Work Week. So if you're booked on any more sessions for the rest of the week, we hope you enjoy those, or if you've been to sessions previously, we hope they were just as informative as today's session has been about EQA. Once again, thank you to our presenters this morning, and thank you to our attendees for coming along. So I'm going to end the session now. Hopefully we'll see you at some more of our events today, but if not, we're certainly likely to see you in the future. So thanks very much.